Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Three Amigos. Today, Ron's going to be talking about what small businesses need to know about economics and in relationship to kind of the politics going on here in California. So, with that, Ron, I'm going to pass it on to you.
All right, thank you. Good to see you, gentlemen. And, economics is something that small business people don't really like to talk about. It's the subject that those of us who took it in college don't really like to recall in many cases because it seemed bone dry and a bunch of numbers and so forth. And I remember suffering through economics, but I've kind of come to the point where I really enjoy it. And I've spent a lot of time studying it and focus primarily on small business. So really, I think there are some basic things that small business people need to understand about economics. And so this is just a real simple illustration today of what economics kind of means. And it boils down to just a few basic principles. And we don't have to allow it to kind of get weighed down with all of their jargon. And we'll just try and speak of it straightforward. And I think when we go through this, we'll all see that understanding some basic principles really does have an awful lot to do with how small businesses are affected. So we'll launch into it. So basically, the economics is called or is defined as a science concerned with process or system by which goods and services are produced, sold, and bought. Well, that's really true, but it's a little bit garbled. I think another way to think about it is just a natural way that people interact to benefit themselves and their families in their communities. And so this entails basically growing, making, trading, and storing material goods. And with that, you can end up with the trade. And so growing, that's really, if we push ourselves back to the real basics now, we're going to go back 10,000 years. How did economics start? Well, you either were hunting or raising animals, or you were planting and growing and harvesting food. And so that's the growing part. Making, you were using natural resources to devise and produce goods. And trading, well, when you found out that you made something that somebody else wanted, or somebody else had something that you wanted, that you could trade and both parties would benefit. And so in the little example that we have here, we've got a fisherman who is really good at fishing, and he's when he gets his catch for the day, he doesn't need more, but he might have more fish than he needs. And so why not trade those and get, say, arrowheads from the guy who's the village expert arrowhead maker, who maybe can make them 2 or 3 times faster than somebody else. And so they can get together and both benefit. And so the last thing is that storing, and that is keeping the excess material goods for future use or lending. Well, that we call that today profit, and that's excess value stored for a rainy day. So in the case that I just mentioned, if the fisherman does really well, say on a given day, and he trades, he has enough fish to trade for 4 arrowheads. And normally he would need about 3 arrowheads to be able to buy other things that he needs, or buy, say, or trade. Maybe his wife needs a cooking pot. Maybe he wants some animal skins, but whatever it is that he needs, he would use those arrowheads a little bit like money and exchange them. Well, that extra arrowhead that he can make every day by fishing a little bit more ends up being stored, and we would call that profit today. Well, he needs to store something, and mostly food. He could store fish, of course, but he may want to store grain. And we call that wealth. And so really, I think we've boiled this down to these are the simple things. This is what people do in a very natural way, just by being people. They make or grow something. They trade that with somebody else who does something that they need, and they come to a mutual agreement about what that price is. And in a competitive market, what happens is the supply and demand will be able to maintain both supply and demand at a fair price. Well, how is that the price determined? So they get together, and the one guy who's the fisherman says, okay, I'll give you 12 fish for 3 arrowheads. They cut a deal. They think that's a good deal. And so, the guy who's doing the arrowhead, he needs 12 fish to feed his large family. And so he does this every day, and he goes home and he makes another 3 arrowheads, or maybe more arrowheads, so that he can get some other things as well. And they're both happy because they're both prospering. So in a free economy, these two, they get to pick the quality, the service, and then they settle on a price that they both determine are in their own self-interest. That's what we call free trade. If the fish catch might be bad for a few days, the fisherman might realize that people will pay a little bit more because there aren't as many fish, and therefore the price naturally goes up. He's laboring hard every day, and if he doesn't have enough fish, for a few days he may go, but at some point he's going to say, gee, I need 4 arrowheads for the 12 fish because I'm having to work harder for it, and there's no place for you to go. But you have to look at the other side too. If the catch is plentiful, other fishermen will have to trade, and the price goes down. And so the price goes up naturally and down naturally based on the supply. And that's what we call the old supply and demand. And when you get the supply equaling the demand, you end up with this equilibrium, and things of course can change from that. And so what is important for small business people is to understand which of these things cause or are important to know for your own business. So here are some of the things that change the supply and demand, that change the way you look at economics. One is a change in demand. Well, this is pretty relevant. Today we have a change in demand for a lot of goods. Meat happens to be one. We're going to use that as an example, but there are a lot of other things. So what has happened recently is that as we have received more money in the economy, now, first of all, Trump's economy created, the best real earnings in many, many years or decades. And so people had a little bit more money. When Biden came in, he added money to people's pockets by sending checks out to virtually everyone. And so now you've got more money, and people's demand changed. They bought more appliances. They bought more food to set back for an emergency for COVID. And so the demand changed quite a bit when COVID came in. So what has happened is that we saw prices go up. The other thing that can happen is changes in supply. As demand went up, and labor got short, they were unable to unload the ships as fast as they should, or normally are able to. And as a result, the supply was sort of artificially choked off, if you will. And so the supply with increased demand really changed the prices. And then changes in production costs. So you may say, well, gee, the problem that I have is not that we have to sell for more, but my costs are more. Well, and then the answer is, well, then you have to sell for more, right? So if you have change in power or transportation costs, there is a certain place where you'll stop producing because you just can't afford to sell at a loss for very long. And in fact, the only way you can afford to sell at a loss is if you have wealth to give up to start with. So you accumulate some wealth in the form of a store or inventory, and you can reduce that. And that's where what would happen to your wealth is if you continue to sell at a loss. or you can raise your prices. Now, when you raise your prices, you're going to have an effect on supply and demand. You have to be careful, and this is a big one, of substitution products and services, which are, of course, caused by supply and demand changes. But there are a lot of substitutions. One example is that, we all have a certain sort of fixed expectation in our mind, even for something as simple as getting lunch. I was with my grandson not too long ago, and we were doing some work around the house, and we needed to kind of get moving. We're going to pick up some sandwiches for a couple of other people. So we just went down past McDonald's and thought we would just drive through, but the line was just horrendous. In other words, the service was extremely poor. And we didn't really care much about what we ate on that particular day. There are days when you would, but so we decided we would go down the street to a competing restaurant. And I think we went to Jack in the Box. And we drove into the restaurant, and they were actually closed. It was a Tuesday, and the sign on the window said, "We're closed every Tuesday due to lack of employees." So the supply of employees is so low because people don't feel like they need to work, that they actually cannot operate on 1 or 2 days a week. So that was out, and so. There was that first substitution. And then the second substitution was we drove past a Taco Bell, and that had a shorter line, and we ended up buying tacos. That's a substitution. In order to satisfy our needs at that time, we didn't have to have a hamburger. We were willing to go to a second hamburger place, and we ended up getting tacos for everybody strictly because of poor service. So there's a simple example of how substitution products can change the supply and demand dynamics. Well, the reason we bring this up is a lot of business people say, well, nobody does what we do. Well, maybe not, but there are a lot of people who do similar things. And given supply and demand, that's how decision makers decide whether or not they would like to buy something different. And so this virtually happens in almost everything. There are very, very few things where you can't find a substitute. You might say, I have to buy electricity, but today, you can use solar. You might say you have to have your natural gas. Well, you use solar again, or you can get I was talking to a lady who just got a wood stove. There are substitutions for most products. So that's
Can I give another example?
Yeah.
Ron, of this? This is a really good way of looking at things. COVID has changed everything. And
yes.
In one area, just as an example, like you gave an example of going to get tacos or getting hamburgers, and then you ended up with tacos. I love to go to Starbucks in the morning, walk in, get my cup of coffee. If I want to sit down and read something, I do it. I'm only there for a couple minutes. But now in our local Starbucks, they won't let people in the facility any longer.
Yeah.
So the only way you can get a cup of coffee is that you have to go through the drive-through, and the drive-through is so long, it's not worth it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I've gone to substitution where I'm making my own coffee at home. I just don't really want to go to Starbucks anymore because of that. And I think a way a business could kind of take advantage of this is by allowing people to come in. They can wear their masks like they're supposed to, but allow them to come in, buy their coffee, and not force them to do something they don't want to do.
Yeah, that's interesting to see. Your interest, your self-interest here was you like Starbucks and you'd like to have a Starbucks cup of coffee, but you're not willing to wait too long for it. Mine is similar. I think Starbucks is fine. I don't appreciate it the way many other people do, but I'll occasionally go in and I really respect what they've done from a business perspective. But I actually have long tired from waiting in their regular lines inside the store, because you've got all of these people who I call it foo-foo coffee. They're not drinking a cup of black coffee or maybe coffee with cream. They're doing all of these other things. It takes time. I, as a plain coffee drinker, have to wait for that I don't have the tolerance for that because I don't believe the quality of Starbucks warrants my waiting in line that long in order to get it. So I substituted long ago by going to their competitors, and I've done the same thing. I've started buying premium coffee at home, and I've started to grind it. And you've got all these great machines that you can do, foam and anything you want to make, you can really make it at home for a lot less money. So that's a case where my tolerance was different than your tolerance potentially. And of course, I know people and have some in my family who they would wait forever to get their special venti, latte, chocolate, whatever it is that they want, because for whatever reason they believe that they're getting a really terrific value at $4.50 or $5 a piece. To me, this is ludicrous, but to them, it's very important. They get to make that choice. What is $5 to them, and what does it take to be able to get that coffee? How long? There's some threshold where they'll stop, but they have a much higher threshold than, say, you or I do. And so what Starbucks has done has been wonderful from a business perspective. There's a huge amount of business that they don't get, though. I'm not sure they care because I think they're doing pretty well. But the original concept of going into a fun place and sitting in a comfortable chair and having a leisurely cup of quality coffee is really over. It's really, I have a specialty drink that I want, and Starbucks is cool. Their brand has added a lot of value, and people will pay for that. So that's an excellent example of this. And then we go on to just a couple of other issues. And I'm going to use, and one is unnatural obstacles to free trade. We've talked a little bit about those, and we could talk forever about natural obstacles to free trade. But in a sense, this is one of the biggest concerns that a small business has. When an entity comes in and gets in the way, and in this particular case, you could call that COVID, and you've got an unnatural obstacle. You could argue that's natural, but it doesn't happen very often. And so COVID has been an unnatural obstacle to free trade in a way, and that's been because of the different regulations that have been imposed, either self or by government. When you have to wear a mask or you don't feel comfortable, safe inside a store, and your behavior changes, now you've got the business person is looking at an unnatural obstacle. And we have these things happen. The most unnatural obstacles come from the government. They, for whatever reason, feel as though they know better on how to, even as far as even set prices in the old days. They've talked about trying to get prices down on various things even now. That's never worked because that's always disrupted supply and demand. They did this during World War II. It was successful only because everybody was patriotic enough to say, we're going to sacrifice and do whatever we have to do in order to win the war. But in a normal economy, there are all kinds of things that get in the way in terms of, say, subsidies, for instance. If you subsidize solar power, you get more solar power. What does that do to the other forms of power that we have? And they end up creating unanticipated consequences so many times. And so that's something that small businesses really have to look at, because you can be put in a very tough situation very quickly there. So here's an example, another example that I thought we'd throw out, and then we can kind of talk about this a little bit. And this happens to be the beef market. Right now, beef prices are soaring. I've seen different numbers of, from 12 to 18%. It's a big, big increase. So 16% is what I put in this particular one, but it has varied a little bit. I think it's a little bit higher than that now. Profits are also up. The meat companies have been able to take advantage of this. And that is that just because they had a certain amount of inventory at a certain price. And oops, I've lost my picture. Excuse me while I try to get that back. A certain amount, there we go. They bought a certain amount of inventory at a certain price. It only lasts for a few days, maybe a week maximum. And so they're able to continue to sell that. But what happens is that while the distributors may be buying meat for the same price, they find that the demand goes up at the store level, and all of a sudden they're out of inventory. So what do? They raise the prices so that it begins to equalize the inventory, and they make more money too. But what people don't hear when you listen to people talking about this is that prices in the meat industry actually had fallen for 5 solid years due to an ample supply of beef, and falling prices increase the demand to some degree, but not enough to be able to increase the price. And farmers are notorious for getting their inventory growth wrong. And so sometimes there are more cows and sometimes there are less cows. And depending on their circumstances, they have to buy or sell at certain times. And so you have a natural supply fluctuation. And that natural supply fluctuation influences the demand and the price. But demand recently soared because families got these government checks, and it increased the better cuts. So you might say, oh, well, people hadn't been able to afford meat and now they're just buying meat. No, that's not what happened. The better cuts of meat are what started to sell. So, you know, your prime rib, your steaks, those went up more than hamburger. And they went up more because people had more disposable income and they thought they would treat themselves. And so the workers then, they stayed home, limiting production at the plants. And so now the plants can't work as much, and they push the demand even higher because the supply is lower. And then in addition to that, China had increased the imports of meat, and that pushed it even higher. So you can see this variety of natural and unnatural things cause the prices to change. And if you happened to be a producer of meat, a landowner of ranch land, a producer, secondary producer, or a transportation, a wholesaler, or a retailer having anything to do with meat, you found that there were fluctuations in your business. All the small business people along the way, they of course pay attention to these things because that is their business. That's what they pay attention to. But they don't tend to take a look at the deep reasons why they happen many times, especially outside of their industry. And that's really where, you know, paying attention to economics is something that you need to know and understand. So increased profits have created cash for expansion. And this cash for expansion has caused them to commit to investing $450 million more. And how are they going to do it? They're going to do it in automation. So there'll be a lot of new plants, a lot of automation. They can't get the workers, so the automation should be able to allow them to develop more plants. Now, why is this that they would invest this money? And the answer, of course, is because they see a profit potential, because people have been willing to pay higher prices for meat. They know it'll come back down, but they would like to try and match the supply and the demand again at a price that they can make more money. If they can grow their industry by growing beef, their beef industry by growing a group of people who love to eat beef, then they will be better off down the road. They also may be able to use this as more of a political statement to help some folks who are anti-meat people realize that people love meat. And there's a huge debate about how many calories are created from the cows that eat the grass, and how many ways that we could develop other substitute products. And that's going to be a big debate for some time to come. But you can see that if they get bigger and have more cash to spend on lobbying and marketing, that puts them in a better position. So they're going to take advantage of this situation. But what happens for the person? The people who want to buy meat, because of the price went up and they continued to buy it, they ended up creating the circumstances for supply, which in fact will bring the price down. What a perfect system, huh? And so the supply will rise to meet the demand, and it will automatically correct itself. And there is no need for the government or anybody else to try to do anything more than that. Okay, so let's go back through this. Economics. It's a science concerned with the process or the system by which goods and services are produced, sold, and bought. And so I hope that makes just a little bit more sense now that we've had a chance to kind of look at some of those basics.
So Ron, I'm going to ask you a question that's kind of, it's not related to the examples that you provided in this wonderful presentation, but it's impacting just about everybody in the country right now, and that's real estate. So right now, we have seen significant increases in the prices of real estate. There is hardly any supply now. There was supply a couple of years ago, but now there isn't. Mm-hmm. And prices have gone up, but 30, 40% in the last couple of years in some areas.
Certainly has.
And in fact, some areas, and I'm living in one right now, you can't even buy a house. There's none for sale. How do you explain all that with the methodology that you've been talking about here?
Well, that's really a simple one. I mean, it's so simple, it's unbelievable. And that is that the government restricts the supply. And then you say, oh, well, the government wants more housing. And in fact, even in California, probably the toughest state in the union in terms of real estate regulation, along with New York, Governor Newsom has actually said we need more supply and we're going to make it happen. So now we're taking government regulations, we're adding more government regulations to mitigate the government regulations. What it really is it's a state versus local kind of clash. So the reason that you have I think, I can't remember if this is the right number, but I mean, it's in the ballpark. The cost of government control, regulations, zoning, and all the things it takes to get a lot ready to build on is in the range of $40,000 to $60,000. Now, that didn't used to be the case. When you could, in the 50s, when you simply had people come and build, and we built in California millions and millions of houses. And those houses are still around. They were mid-century houses, very, very popular with younger groups. And so those houses were built, and you might say, well, but they were cheap and they didn't do this and they didn't do that. Well, okay, there may be some truth to that. I mean, we went through a period in the 80s when some of the wiring wasn't good, and we had to switch back to copper because they were trying to use aluminum. So they've made some mistakes. Again, regulations caused that.
Let me ask you the follow-up question. Over the next year or two, do you see any reason why things would change? Because there's not going to be a significant increase in supply of homes. And a lot of people are worried there's going to be a crash. Yeah. Prices are going to go back down that way. How do you kind of look at the future? Because we all know the future is where the real reality is.
Well, and you see the interesting thing is that you have a crash because markets get too hot or too high, and there's a psychology to all of this that business people need to try to understand if they can for their particular kind of business. The real estate people certainly try to, but they don't have a very good record of being good. And I meant to say the builders, but the builders don't have a really good record of matching supply and demand. But in a lot of ways, they would say it's out of their control because they have so much trouble getting through EPA and getting the approval just to start building a piece of land. And then you have environmental groups and local neighbors who will get together and say, no, we don't want that kind of development here, even though it was zoned and there supposedly are property rights based on, you buy a piece of property, it comes with a certain zoning. The expectation of the owner is that you should be able to do whatever is legal on that piece of property. And then you have interest groups jumping into the fray and arguing about it after the fact in terms of large projects. So the government is so deeply involved that you really have destroyed normal supply and demand. So what we've talked about and what we've illustrated here does not exist in California and in many other states. It just doesn't exist. There is no natural supply and demand. And so and I would be willing to say to you that while you could argue that you don't want to have unfettered growth all across California, that's already happened. I mean, Los Angeles is a natural result of allowing lots and lots of people to move to a really wonderful place with weather and jobs in a tremendous success story up until 10 or 20 years ago maybe, but the government has been so involved that there is no natural state, no natural economy anymore. It is always an economy that is pushed and pulled and influenced by all of the myriad of rules out there. So it used to be that a small guy could go buy a piece of land that was ready to build on and just build a house. You don't see those businesses anymore. They can't do that. You do have a few people who will build luxury houses and do custom work. But you're talking in California, you're talking in the $1 million and up range. So the average person can't go build. When I was in Colorado, I just bought a piece of property and designed the house myself and built it and hired a few contractors and built it myself. It doesn't happen anymore. It doesn't happen. So, why? Because the natural supply and demand has been completely distorted because of regulations. Now, we want safety regulations, right? We don't want to buy materials that are inferior and will be unsafe. And so we're willing to pay for something like that. But I think it's we've gone way beyond building codes just for safety. It has an awful lot to do with what people think are larger issues, like ozone and other environmental issues there, which are much more complex. But the natural ability to buy and sell and do what you want with your property is, unfortunately, it's pretty well gone. So you ask, why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because it's too overregulated.
Well, it's not that way in other states. I know in Michigan, we were able to build stuff at a lot less regulation. We put a cabin
that's right.
on a 40-acre piece of property and never even went to see the city.
Oh, I agree. And I think you're absolutely right. And so California is the poster boy for how not to do it. Because the reason that we seem, here we have a state that most people think is filled up with people, which is anything but that. We've got two major cities, major megapolis areas, but the rest of the state, probably 95% of the state is open and is farmland or desert land or mountains. There's plenty of land in this state, but yet we seem not to be able to do what, say, Michigan can do. And that's because the state wants to have their hand in everything. And so as a result, you have a natural sense of how to build your house in many states still, but an unnatural one in California. Certainly New York is almost as bad. Why is it that Florida manages to keep they're growing faster than any other state, and they manage to have houses for anybody who wants to move there? The only thing that's different is government regulation. That's the only thing that's different.
I agree with you, Ron, that, regulation has a tremendous amount to do with it, but we both all know that lobbyists have a powerful influence no matter where they are. Last year, we subsidized the oil and gas industry in the tune of about $8 billion. And we do that with everything. There are lobbyists that are working on behalf of businesses and industry all the time to be able to help them manipulate the markets for their interests.
Well, I agree with you, and I think lobbyists do an awful lot to help government make bad decisions, and some of them are good. But you mentioned gas. That's not an open and free business. That's been regulated since the inception, and so the regulated industries have their own lobbyists to do what? For their own benefit. And I don't have a problem for them fighting for their own benefit, but the gas companies have never been anything but regulated. And so we get what we get here. So when you say there are subsidies, okay, there are subsidies. I am for removing all 100% of subsidies and allowing the natural economy to take care of itself. It doesn't need caretakers.
Well, I agree, but you try to tell that to the organizations and the industries who are trying to manipulate things in their interests.
Well, they're doing things in their own self-interest, and I think that's fine. That's actually, Milton Friedman has, he built his reputation on saying people make good decisions based on their own self-interest, not selfishness. They're two different terms. They mean two different things, but they're own self-interest. If people make their own decisions, they make good ones. And we have prices.
That sounds an awful
prices that are commensurate when they make good decisions.
Right. That sounds an awful lot like Ayn Rand, which has some merit. Everybody has to do their own self-interest, and in order to make that happen, you need to withdraw or remove restrictions on those things. If people were more inclined to think of their self-interest not as something for themselves, but as you pointed out, NIMBY is a huge problem in California. No matter where you go, people, if we need something done, like a landfill or whatever, everybody wants it done in somebody else's neighborhood, not theirs. So switch from being self-interested to selfish.
Well, I'm not so sure that I'm not sure that you can really join those that way. It's easy to do, though, and a lot of people do that. And I know you have a tendency, to see that as becoming selfish. But if people don't make decisions with their own self-interest, then they make bad decisions. Then they're not good decisions. Being selfish, is maybe a little further down on the scale, but is it really saying that you're selfish to just simply want to be able to get rid of your trash?
No.
Will people pay a little bit more money to have it properly disposed of and be put in a place that is okay for everybody? Does a person who sells the land to the city who wants to put a landfill there not deal in his own self-interest when he decides to sell it at a high price because nobody else wants that land? You see, if you let everybody just do it based on their self-interest, you get all of these things to happen at the right price.
Okay.
I would love to have more gas companies compete with gas. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I'd love to have an unregulated solar industry to compete with gas and electricity. But now we're even, the state of California is even talking about changing the rates at which you can sell back your electricity to the power companies.
Right.
Some people say that will kill the solar industry. And so you see, you know, wherever they poke in, something else comes out.
Yeah.
You can't ever find a place where you go, oh, wow, that was a perfect solution because government got involved. My big overriding point here is that the economics is like nature. It's natural. It happens automatically. And it has to do with the human personality and psychology and how we interact with each other and how we take care of ourselves. It's totally natural. And so the only thing that can happen when you mess around with nature is you get bitten. And, you know, Mother Nature will get you back sooner or later. I mean, if we do pollute this place so badly that we can't live here or don't enjoy it, then Mother Nature will ultimately win.
No, and last year we spent $700